Good morning, Miss Edwards. Miss Graham.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yesterday we were just talking about Dr. Lawler, and I think we were talking about at the close the issues regarding his instruction, and I'd like to carry on doing that today if I may. I think yesterday during your evidence you'd talked about wanting to know the position, seeking to clarify in relation to cause of death the possibility of asphyxia, mechanical asphyxia, positional asphyxia, and they were important from the point of establishing a causal link. And
a mechanism of death, I think I'd say.
Yes, well, I'm reading from your evidence, and you said they were those were important from a point of establishing a causal link. I think, though, it did at one point you did use the word mechanism.
Yes.
Thanks. I just want to ask you to look very briefly at the final post-mortem report, which Dr. Shearer prepared, PERC 01445, and we'll have that on the screen. There we are. Now, this is a PDF version, and I think there are 32 pages on the PDF, but I'm interested in pages 16, 17, 18 of the PDF, although they don't necessarily correspond to the page numbers on the report. Here we are. This is the conclusions of the final post-mortem report, and you'll see that Dr. Shearer and her colleague have explained the circumstances, and at paragraph 3 they talk, if we can move down the page, they talk towards the bottom of that paragraph. You'll see neuropathology was undertaken which showed changes consistent with evolving global ischemic brain injury secondary to cardiac arrest, with resuscitation and a short survival period. So my understanding is that cardiac arrest occurred, then there's resuscitation, and from the signs that can be noticed by the pathologist are noted here in the conclusions. And then can we move on to page 17 of the PDF. Paragraph 3, there's discussion of the PAVA and CS sprays and the role that they played, if any. We've heard evidence they didn't play any role in the death. But there's mention there of Dr. Shearer considering pre-existing cardiac problems which can be worsened, but there was no post-mortem findings to suggest that Mr. Bio had a pre-existing heart abnormality. Do you see that?
I do.
And then on the next page, which is page 18 of the PDF, page 17 of the final report, there's an explanation here, just very briefly to go through this. In terms of the history, if we can, there we are. In terms of the history of restraint here, Mr. Bio was reportedly face down with his hands cuffed in front of him. This is supported by the presence of injury 16. His legs were tied around the knees and ankles, and at least 4 officers were restraining him. Post-mortem examination showed the presence of petechial hemorrhages within the eyes, and whilst these are not specific and can be seen in someone who has been resuscitated, they could indicate a degree of asphyxia. In this case, given the reported circumstances, possible causes of asphyxia would include positional, the position of the body interferes with breathing, and mechanical, something impeding the body's ability to use muscles for breathing. And then Dr. Shearer goes on to say, taking everything into consideration, death here was sudden in nature. In summary, there was no evidence of gross or histological natural disease that would account for death. Toxicology revealed MDMA and alpha-PVP, and these drugs could potentially have caused sudden death at any time due to a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. That said, it is recognised that restraint in itself can be a cause or contributing factor in some deaths, and given the circumstances, in that this man was restrained at the time of his respiratory arrest and post-mortem examination showed petechial hemorrhages, That may represent a degree of asphyxia. It cannot be completely excluded that restraint has also had a role to play in death here. So these are the comments and the conclusions of Dr. Shearer and Dr. Buhadir. And I appreciate yesterday you said that you were interested in exploring and clarifying the possibility of asphyxia, mechanical asphyxia and positional asphyxia, all of which are mentioned in this final post-mortem report. And you wanted to seek out that clarity, and that was one of the reasons that Dr. Lawler was instructed. I'm wondering why you didn't go back to Dr. Shearer and Dr. Buhadir, first of all, to clarify and explore these areas of interest to you, rather than seeking out a further pathologist. And as I said yesterday, there were a number of forensic pathologists involved in this investigation. It wasn't just Shearer and Buhadir, there was Carey, there was Crane, and then there was Lawler. And I'm wondering why you didn't just go back to Shearer.
I think by the time I was involved, there were a number, and we talked about this yesterday, there were a number of reports from experts with similar qualifications, and they didn't all come to the same conclusions. And I wanted really to have an oversight and a further understanding. I wanted an expert, perhaps, as we talked about yesterday, who was an expert in asphyxia, because of his experience with Hillsborough. I wanted a little bit more input to assist me in how to reconcile the expert reports that I had.
And when you say they didn't all come to the same conclusions, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that all of the forensic pathologists agreed on the cause of death.
I think, I can't remember the details, I haven't gone over them in detail, the specific reports, but my recollection is that they might have agreed in the final conclusions, but the route to get there, there were differing opinions.
And do you remember what the differences were that were significant to the Crown?
I don't, but the other thing that strikes me as you were taking me through that document is the circumstances that the experts, the pathologists were aware of at the time, was the information that the Crown and the police and the PERC knew at the time. But of course, with the further investigation, we knew that Mr. Bio was not face down all the time. And that's one of the things that had concerned me with regard to the initial description, because the potential for being face down and being cuffed to the front at the same time didn't seem to me to be possible. And that's one of the reasons why we really looked at that in detail, as well as the differing explanations from the various witnesses. So the factual position had changed. The medical position, there had been a lot of experts and evidence obtained before I was involved. My view was that they perhaps weren't exactly the right experts, and I had instructed the further specialist experts. I think we talked about yesterday the pharmacologist and the bone specialist, and this. Hopefully Dr. Lawler was going to assist us in just reviewing everything that we had to make sure that I wasn't misunderstanding anything, or that he had any expert input to give us. He might not have, but that's what we were looking for. We were looking really to have the fullest understanding that we could.
So two things that you've mentioned there in that answer. You understood that the factual position had changed. Was it your understanding that as the investigations progressed, that more information became available to the Crown about the factual position?
Exactly.
And on that basis, did you want to ensure that with each of the experts at the time they were instructed, at the time you consulted with them, that the factual position as understood at that specific time would be set out very clearly for the experts?
As much as possible, yes.
Always
As
on
well
the
as
understanding it could change in the future if more
Yeah.
information came to light.
And also making sure that they had the necessary foundation documents as well.
Right.
And I think we talked about yesterday about the different stages of an investigation with regard to what you're looking for at consultation.
And we also talked yesterday about where there's maybe a dispute or disagreement between witnesses as to the true factual position and what actually happened. And where there is a dispute between different witnesses, was that something also that you wished to make clear to experts so they could determine or give an opinion on whether one version changed their opinions on the mechanism or the cause of death?
Unless we could be sure about which witness we were going to accept. So, for example, if we formed the view that witness X couldn't possibly have seen Act Y because of the position that they were in or the timing, then we would have simply not necessarily discounted it, but looked at the evidence that we could support.
Where you had evidence from different eyewitnesses, where they had the capacity to view what was happening, but it wasn't clear which version was true or accurate, and where that would maybe have to be left up to the jury in a criminal trial. What did the Crown do in that situation where they could not exclude one of the versions that was available?
We just made sure that it was there, it was noted, and that we took into account both versions.
And as part of your instruction of the experts, as part of your consultation with the experts, did you identify alternative factual hypotheses? I think yesterday you talked about a factual matrix where there were different versions.
I can't remember, I don't know if which particular expert you're speaking about. If there was a concern and an issue that I thought was important for that expert for the stage of the investigation that we were at, which was considering the Crown case at its highest, then I would have put that to the expert or discussed it with the expert.
But at the very least, I think yesterday you said you liked to have a core Crown theory where you put the Crown case at its highest. I think yesterday you described it as the most prejudicial version of the facts. You would want that to be considered by each expert.
So, for example, I think a good example of what you're just asking about is the consultation, or certainly the discussions even prior to my consultation with the OST expert, was the potential for one witness describing a pile-up on top of Mr. Byron. So yes, that is the Crown case, would potentially be the Crown case at its highest, and something that we would want to explore with the expert. And I do remember particularly his answer to that.
So one example, a witness has given a statement available to the Crown describing a pile-up, and that would be something that would be discussed with the expert so they could give an opinion.
Yes.
On whether that was important or changed their views.
Yes.
There may be alternative evidence available to the Crown which does not suggest anything other than a perfectly normal non-pile-up situation, and that is something that you would use to contrast with the expert. Yes,
I'm pausing because my recollection is that the discussion that I had with the expert was particularly that Crown evidence at its highest. The expert will have had all the other statements and the timeline and the letter of instruction.
So if nothing else, you put the Crown theory, the Crown position at its highest, and that is discussed with the expert.
Yes. If I think it needs clarified on top of the report.
Thank you. Now, my understanding is, and I think in his report, Dr. Lawler said he had no criticisms of either the methodology or the approach adopted by Dr. Shearer and Buhadir. And I'd like to go back to his report. And was that your understanding, that he did not criticise the methodology or the approach taken by the two pathologists who conducted the post-mortem?
That's my recollection. In fact, my recollection is that there wasn't really any issue about the original post-mortem. There was no real criticism of it at all.
Thank by any of the experts?
No, even in the not finding the rib fracture, that was initially, that was considered perfectly acceptable because it was a difficult fracture to find.
And in fact, it was only found after a proper scan or full body scan.
CT scan, I think,
CT
and
scan.
I think that's also normal in these types of situations as well.
Thank you. Could we go back to Dr. Lawler's first report, which was May 2017, COPFS 00333, and we see here it's 22nd of May 2017. This is the report, the first report prepared in response to the letter of instruction that we looked at yesterday, which asked him to review the methodology of the other reports. And we'll see that it's addressed to Mr. MacLeod, and we've heard evidence that the letter of instruction was prepared by Mr. MacLeod, and Dr. Lawler responded by sending his report to Mr. MacLeod. Did you have a hand in reviewing the letter of instruction that went to Dr. Lawler?
I can't remember. I have seen correspondence where I have had the opportunity to review Martin Graves' letter of instruction, but at this stage in May of 2017, I don't know if that's something that I was involved in.
Thank you. So if we could look, first of all, I only want to look at certain sections of this. This is a lengthy report. Could we look first of all at page 11 of 26? And this relates to a Dr. Lipsage, whose name you may recall. Keep going.
I recall him, but I don't recall the speciality.
Right, well, the first line here on page 11 says, Dr. Lipsage is an emeritus consultant psychiatrist, and he addresses the deceased's mental state.
And I don't remember whether this doctor was instructed before or after I became the allocated deputy. I suspect before.
He was instructed after.
Okay.
Dr. Lipsage is a consultant psychiatrist. Now, then we can look at page 12, and I'd like to look at there's comments. I don't want to look at those in any detail, but you see at the comments section, this expert confirms what I, as an acknowledged non-expert in this field, had concluded. The conclusions don't matter for my purposes. I'm interested in the fact that Dr. Lawler has stipulated here that he is a non-expert in the field. He is not a consultant psychiatrist himself. He was a forensic pathologist, and Dr. Lipsage was a psychiatrist. I asked James Wolfe, the former Lord Advocate, about this passage in the report from Dr. Lawler, and I asked him for any comments that he had in relation to a forensic pathologist such as Dr. Lawler being asked to comment on the methodology and approach of a consultant psychiatrist. And I noted, and it's noted in the transcript, that he was smiling, and he said, well, as simply as a matter of the law of evidence, an expert is qualified only to speak to areas in which the expert has expertise. And to the extent that a witness offers opinion evidence on matters where they don't have expertise, that evidence is not of any evidential value, or it's not evidence, I suppose. And I asked, if it's not of any evidential value, I said, in fact, is it admissible? And he said, no. I'm interested in your comments about why Dr. Lawler was instructed to consider the methodology and the approach and the conclusions of a consultant psychiatrist when he himself recognises he is not an expert in that field.
I think the process that we had anticipated Dr. Lawler would go through would be to essentially what I talked about yesterday is my understanding of what a pathologist does post the autopsy and comes to a final report, which is taking into account all the information, including the factual circumstances. In fact, you took me to earlier the final conclusions in the pathologist's report. So I think we had understood that we'd asked Dr. Lawler to go through that kind of process. It was not necessarily that this evidence, this particular part of the evidence, was going to be admissible in court. It was to assist us in the investigation. It may well be that he came to the comment section and said, I can say nothing about this, and that would be fine. The words that are used, methodology and approach, I'm not sure those were words that I would particularly want to take out in his instructions. I just wanted to make sure that he had that report. This is the information that we haven't gathered. Is it of relevance to your job, to what you're going to tell us? If it's not, then simply, I'd expect him simply to put it to one side and say, I have no comments to make. But that was the purpose of that exercise, and it was really the fact that we had lots and lots of reports, and we were looking for assistance in two ways: assistance with regard to asphyxia, and also just making sense of everything that we had.
Before he was instructed, sent the copy of the consultant psychiatrist report, and specifically requested and instructed to consider the methodology and approach adopted, and specifically whether or to what extent he agreed with the conclusions and findings of the others who have been instructed. I appreciate your explaining the approach that was taken, but I'm wondering about the merit and the value of that approach to the Crown, given he had no qualifications in psychiatry, no experience in psychiatry, and really no practice in that sense at all. And I'm just wondering what the value and the merit of this exercise was.
I think I've already explained that I thought that there would be value if the expert, we gave the expert Dr. Lawler a report which he felt he couldn't comment on at all and had no value with regard to his consideration of the questions that we were asking, then we would expect him to say, I just can't comment, and that would have been perfectly acceptable. Again, this particular process wasn't specifically looking at an expert that we could lead necessarily in court, or it might be an expert that we could lead on a particular point, but not necessarily this whole process.
So you envisage that he may just simply say, I can't, I've read the report, I've considered the report, but I can't add anything helpful.
Absolutely. And that would be perfectly acceptable and perfectly proper.
Did you not anticipate that he might say that before you even instructed him?
I can't remember how closely I was involved in the instruction letter, whether I knew what he was being given, but certainly what I've told you is in my head what I expected Dr. Lawler to be able to do. But the nuts and bolts of what he was being asked to do and how we'd go about it, I left that, as far as I can recall, to the team and to Dr. Lawler himself. He may have come back to us and said, I can't help you at all. And that's, again, perfectly acceptable, and I think a response that throughout my career we've had from many experts.
All right. Can we move on to page 4 of 6, please? And this is Professor Michael Edelston who's mentioned. Well, this, sorry, actually, I think I've accidentally missed a page of my notes. Can we turn to page 14 of 26, please? And this relates to Dr. Bleetman. I think we just, I think that's it. If we can go to, there we are. Dr. Anthony Bleetman is a consultant in emergency medicine. And if we look at the comments section, I think you'll see that here we are. Again, same position as before. Dr. Lawler says Dr. Bleetman provides what I, as a non-expert, consider to be a good review of the entity. And he goes on to make a number of comments about his report. And really the position, my question is the same. Why instruct Dr. Lawler to review the report of Dr. Bleetman and provide comment on an area where he's clearly not an expert? He's no qualifications, no experience.
And my answer is the same.
Answer is the same. And then can we look at pages 23 and 24 of 26? And I'm interested in Professor Fremont. Now, Dr. Lawler is a forensic pathologist. Professor Fremont is an osteoarticular pathologist. So they're both pathologists, but as we understand it, Professor Fremont has a specialism. We talked about it yesterday. The Home Office asked him to train up another osteoarticular pathologist, and that relates to bones. And this was particularly in relation to the fractured rib, the timing and the mechanism and use of force that may be applied. And looking at this now, were you satisfied that as a forensic pathologist, Dr. Lawler was in a position to comment on the methodology and approach and the conclusions of Professor Fremont?
I think, as I said earlier, I personally was more interested in the conclusions and how that would affect any view that Dr. Lawler had. I can't think that I would be expecting Dr. Lawler to critique the professor's methodology. So I wasn't expecting that. And I would probably expect Dr. Lawler simply to say, I don't disagree with any of that. I can't, if that's his conclusions, he is the expert. If it had changed anything, any view that he was coming to, then that's what I would expect him to say.
Did you expect Dr. Lawler to provide some information about the qualifications which he had, which may allow him to comment on Professor Fremont's evidence?
No, because of the answer I've just said. I wasn't really expecting him to critique the evidence of Dr. Fremont. It was for him to look at the conclusions and tell us if that changed any view that he had.
Right. So although Lawler was instructed to consider the methodology and the approach taken, and to tell you whether he agreed with the conclusions or the findings, that wasn't really what you were expecting from Dr. Lawler.
I think, not with regard to this particular expert, and it may well be that there was just one, I'm sure, one letter of instruction which covered all the experts, and it might be that some experts that we did want them to comment on the methodology.
And if there were nuances, were those things that you would explore at consultation then?
I might do, if that's something that was important for my final thinking. I remember that along with Les Brown, I did consult with Dr. Lawler, and we went down to visit him. I remember the journey because it was quite a difficult journey. There was lots of trains to get there. I don't remember the consultation being particularly long. I remember us going through his report and then focusing in on the asphyxial aspects, which I was interested in.
Could we look at a supplementary report that Dr. Lawler prepared, which is COPFS 00034. And you'll see this is again addressed to Mr. MacLeod, dated the 13th of August 2017. I'd like to ask you about two specific entries. The first is on page 2. This relates to Professor Fremont. You'll see there. He's asked to look at him again. Can we look at page 2, please? Although I readily accept that I am not a specialised osteoarticular pathologist, I do have a career background of diagnostic histopathology, albeit a long time ago, ! And I asked James Wolfe about this approach to Dr. Lawler, and asked him about the fact that Dr. Lawler acknowledged he wasn't a specialist in the field, although he did have some background. And James Wolfe said, I asked him if he expected that would be explored in some detail in relation to the value of any comments Dr. Lawler made in relation to Professor Fremont. And James Wolfe indicated yes, he thought that that was something that would be explored with Dr. Lawler to assess the weight, really, or the value to the Crown of his views on Professor Fremont's report. Is that something that you did with Dr. Lawler?
As I've explained, at this stage, we weren't looking at particularly admissibility of the evidence about all the other reports from Dr. Lawler. So we weren't looking at admissibility in court. We were looking at assistance that he could give us. As I understand what he's saying there is, he's simply saying that the very technical evidence that Dr. Freeman was able to give, that he was able to understand what he was talking about. He was able to tell us that the PowerPoint was very helpful. I remember the PowerPoint. And really that's as much as I was happy with that at this stage. If it got to a further stage and we were initiating proceedings and I was going to use Dr. Lawler as an expert, what I would normally do is go through a trial and take all the source evidence, so all the original experts that I wanted to lead, and then finally, if there was anything that I required clarification from the reviewing expert, then I would call that reviewing expert. But at the end of the day, if I called all the source evidence that I needed, I wouldn't necessarily call this witness at the end.
So I don't really want to ask you about admissibility, because I appreciate this wasn't at the stage that you were going into trial.
No. But I think you put to me earlier about James Wolfe's comments.
Yes.
And that was his answer.
I did. But James Wolfe was saying, yes, I talked about admissibility earlier, but let me just tell you what I said in relation to James Wolfe, because I'm quoting from his evidence. We pointed out that Dr. Lawler was not a specialist in the field, but he does say he has some background of diagnostic histopathology, albeit a long time ago. And I asked James Wolfe, is that something that you would have expected would be explored in some detail in relation to the value of any comments Dr. Lawler makes in relation to Professor Fremont? I wasn't asking him about admissibility. I was asking him about the value of comments and the opinion evidence that Dr. Lawler was giving. And he agreed, yes, he would have expected that that would be explored. So the question I'm asking you is, if we think not about admissibility on this occasion, but in relation to the value of the assistance you can get from Dr. Lawler, so the quality of that assistance in relation to Professor Fremont, did you explore in detail this comment that he was not a specialist? He's not a specialist osteoarticular pathologist, but he did have a career background of diagnostic histopathology, albeit a long time ago. So did you ask questions along the lines of how long ago? What was your experience at the time? Has it affected your ability to comment because you have not been involved for many years? Did you ask and explore the questions of his qualifications and his experience in relation to osteoarticular pathologists and the views of Professor Fremont?
I don't think so. And the reason for that is if he had disagreed with Professor Fremont, then I would want to explore that. But he was agreeing with Professor Fremont, and I had no issues with that.
Did you instruct the precognoser or anyone in the team to explore with Dr. Lawler his qualifications and experience, and consider whether he was suitably qualified and in a position to comment in any way on Professor Fremont's views?
I think his qualifications and experience excuse me, were extensively explored before he was instructed. With regard specifically to the osteoarticular pathology, I'm not sure because I don't recall when Professor Fremont's report was obtained, whether it was prior or after we'd instructed Dr. Lawler.
My understanding is that Dr. Lawler was instructed as a reviewing pathologist, and we talked yesterday about Les Brown saying it may have been a Lord Advocate who had introduced the idea of a reviewing pathologist, and I think yesterday you spoke about having gone down that that approach?
Yes, it's not an approach that's alien to me. So it is one that I have used with a paediatric consultant.
Were you involved, sorry, I can't recall your evidence history, were you involved in the identification of Dr. Lawler?
I don't think so. But I wasn't involved in the legwork of the identification of any of the experts unless it's someone that I knew from my own experience. So I did have experience with Professor Fremont, and so I was able to identify him, although I suspect I didn't remember his name.
Right. And in terms of the, if I can say, use the phrase due diligence or the research and the checking in terms of qualifications, experience, expertise, specialisms, any of that, who were you expecting to carry out that work?
The case preparation team. And I know that they were doing that because I was getting reports about, from recollection, CVs or people that potentially that they might have identified, not necessarily for the job that we wanted Dr. Lawler to do, but throughout the case.
So were you always provided with some detailed information about the qualifications and experience of every expert?
Not always, no.
In relation to Dr. Lawler?
I can't remember, but I suspect I did see his CV. I knew about his experience in the Home Office, and I knew about Hillsborough, and I knew about his particular expertise in that area.
And was it your practice in a consultation to explore areas such as qualifications and experience, insofar as they may be relevant?
Sometimes, if it was relevant, but in the stage of this investigation, no, that wasn't something that I would want to do at consultation. That might have been an earlier stage in the preparation of the precognition, but the consultations for my purpose, for me, had a specific purpose, and that was to expand my knowledge and make sure that I had a full understanding of all the expert evidence and how it fitted into the factual matrix.
So in a situation where an expert, Dr. Lawler on this occasion, specifies in a report that he's not a specialist and his background in the area was a long time ago, is that something that you considered merited further investigation, either by the precognoser or the team or by you yourself?
No, it just, at that stage, it just meant that I was satisfied that he acknowledged he wasn't an expert. If he had any particular views with regard to how it affected any of his final conclusions, then I would take that on board. But it just meant that I was able to deal with the information that he put in that particular part of his report appropriately.
So you didn't discuss any of this with Dr. Lawler at consultation?
I don't think so.
And on page 4, please, if we move on to Professor Edelston. He is a consultant clinical toxicologist, and he was being asked about the possible effect of drugs. And then on page 5, Dr. Lawler says, Professor Edelston's area of expertise is significantly different from mine, but he found his report very interesting. And again, I asked James Wolfe about this and asked if he had any concerns. Given the area of expertise of Professor Edelston was significantly different from Dr. Lawler, I asked Mr. Wolfe if he had any concerns about the value of any comments he could give regarding the methodology or the opinions of Professor Edelston. And Mr. Wolfe said he clearly can't give expert evidence in an area of expertise that is not his own area of expertise, whether as a skilled scientist or medical scientist. And so, again, is your position in relation to that the same as you've already described?
It is, and although here toxicology is something that pathologists, I'm sure they told you, are well used to reviewing before they produce their final report with the final cause of death. So here, that's more closely replicating the process he would go through in a pathology report. And I think his final paragraph in that supplementary report really supports what I've been saying to you this morning, is that I was looking to make sure that nothing we had would change the views that he was giving us in the areas that he could, that his speciality was in, and that there is confirmed in the final paragraph.
Right. So really, rather than asking Dr. Lawler to look at the methodology and the approach and to tell you whether he agreed with the conclusions and findings of others, which was what the wording of the letter of instruction was, rather than that, you were actually just saying, is there anything in here that makes you change your mind?
Yes, although from recollection there might have been areas where I was concerned about the qualifications of an expert or the validity of the conclusions, and it may be that that we were looking for that as in those particular cases. So it may be that the letter of instruction was too general with regard to the individual experts, but also if I'd really thought about it, that might have been an approach that we wanted to give a broad brush approach, because we might not have wanted to point particularly at individual reports. We wanted his conclusions, not ours.
When you say if I'd really thought about it, what do you mean?
Well, as I'm telling you now, you're asking me those questions, and I'm saying, well, maybe we could have separated it out. But as I'm telling you that, I'm thinking, well, actually, maybe we shouldn't separate it out. Maybe there's a good argument for not separating it out.
Let's look at, maybe we don't need to look at it, we looked at it earlier, the conclusion on cause of death. And I think that, as I understand it, there was no, I think I've already asked you about this actually, I'll move on from this. Can we move on to another expert? Well, one last thing. We've heard evidence about the time it took for Dr. Lawler to be instructed on a number of occasions and to come back and give reports. And obviously you consulted with him. You talked yesterday about time pressures and wanting to have things reach a conclusion because a considerable period of time had already passed. Did you consider those time pressures when you asked Dr. Lawler to embark on the exercise that he was instructed to do?
Time pressures were always, it was always in my mind. Obviously we wanted the process that we were going through and any subsequent process to be Article 2 compliant, and so there was a pressure of getting things done as quickly and efficiently as possible, but while making sure that we followed all leads and did as much investigation as we felt was necessary. You asked me earlier why we didn't just stop at the original pathologists and go back to them and consult with them, why I didn't instruct that. I can't remember whether that had already been done, but by the time I became involved, there were a range of experts from the same speciality as I recall, and so we'd really gone past that stage. And by the time we'd gone past that stage, it was really important to bottom everything out that we had.
Can I move on to ask you some questions about an expert called Dr. Karch? And we've heard evidence, you may have heard others give evidence about Dr. Karch. He was instructed by PERC, so prior to your involvement in the matter. And his report, his first report came in on the 10th of September 2015. And I understand, and you can perhaps confirm, that this was one of the expert reports that you had available to you. You talked yesterday about being given the PERC reports, interim and final, and some expert reports. Now, Karch's report had been prepared by the time you came on board as the allocated AD. Was that one of the reports that you were sent?
I think so. There is an email from Les Brown, and he is sending me very early on and after I was instructed the range of reports. I remember there were, I've looked at it recently but I can't remember which ones they were, but there were four attachments, and I'm sure you have that email.
We know there were two expert reports prepared by Dr. Karch in relation to separate letters of instruction, one from August, one from September, but his two reports are both dated the 10th of September.
Okay, I don't remember two reports, but that's not to say that they weren't two reports.
And we've also heard about an expert called Payne James that had been instructed at an early stage as well. Was that one of the other reports that you had?
I think so.
We've heard evidence.
And I think I might have had a report from Nat Carey as well.
Oh, right. Thank you. So we've
and
heard
maybe Shepherd now that I'm thinking about it. So that would be the 4.
I see.
I
Thank you.
think.
We heard evidence from Stephen McGowan, and he talked about a meeting with the family, and again this took place prior to your involvement on the 26th of August 2015, where the family, through their solicitor, expressed concerns about the instruction of Dr. Karch, and those concerns were also expressed by Deborah Coles, who is a director of Inquest. And Stephen Gowan gave evidence to the inquiry that after that meeting there had been some research done, further research done by the Crown on Dr. Stephen Karch, and he looked at 2 things. He described his notebooks where he'd noted concerns about Dr. Karch, where he's instructed in defence of police in the United States. He noted that Dr. Carey also had serious concerns, and he was described and noted by McGowan as a proponent of excited delirium. He sat on a panel in the US who exclude restraint techniques and positional asphyxiation, and there were various issues about Dr. Karch and his position on excited delirium. And he noted Deborah Cole's concerns. And in evidence, he said, when we looked at Dr. Karch in more detail, it did seem that his research was funded entirely by US military and law enforcement. And there was also a concern, and an element was in relation to what the Crown had been told about his advocacy, as he described it, for excited delirium. And there seemed to be, as he put it, a lack of independence. Now, were you aware of any of that in relation to Stephen McGowan and the meeting with the family and the concerns that had been expressed by Dr. Karch in relation to Dr. Karch?
When the Rule 8 request came in and I prepared my statement, as I've already indicated, I didn't have papers available to me and I had no memory of that. I do remember Karch being an outrider or an outlier, and that his opinions didn't fit with anyone else. Now that I have thought about it, I do remember there being issues with Dr. Karch. I'm not sure I knew as much detail as you've just given me.
You've watched the evidence of Les Brown, I think you said.
I have watched
yesterday.
the evidence of Les Brown, and I've watched some of the evidence of Stephen McGowan as well, and Lindsay Miller, so I am aware of you asking those questions.
So you'll be aware of the background, and you'll have heard me ask questions of the article in Scottish Sun on Sunday on the 1st of November 2015, again before you were involved, where Karch was quoted in relation to comments about heart disease and steroids. And then we've also heard, and you will have listened to the comments by Les Brown in evidence about the Lord Advocate at the time, who was Frank Mulholland then, who had understood Karch to be a forensic pathologist and expert in cardiac pathology, but who expressed reservations, if I can put it in that way, about Dr. Karch. And in his inquiry statement, Lord Mulholland said, an expert witness will provide independent assistance to the court by way of objective, unbiased opinion in relation to matters within his expertise. His interview to a newspaper was inconsistent with his duties as an independent expert. And in relation to Dr. Lawler, to come back to that for a moment, and this, he had been sent the Karch report. He was sent that in 2017, so not quite 2 years after the article and the comments by the Lord Advocate. And he was asked to comment on that and review the methodology and such like. And Dr. Lawler in his report describes his understanding of Dr. Karch as a forensic pathologist based in America. You were allocated in August 2016. At that time, were you aware of the history with Dr. Karch?
I don't think in that detail. I was aware that there was an issue. I was aware that his medical opinion had to be looked at with caution. But as part of the case papers, it was still a report that was there that we had obtained. If there was going to be any subsequent trial, it had to be dealt with. It would have to have been disclosed. And so I required to understand the report and understand where it had weaknesses. It's because I was considering at that stage doesn't mean that I was going to rely on it. It may well be, in fact it was, simply that I was looking to find out how I would deal with this expert's report.
And if we look at your statement at paragraphs 22 and 53, sorry, I've not got a note of that. It's SBPI 00445. And if we look at 22, and first of all, and you said at the time you prepared this response to the inquiry team, this is before you had the papers, before you'd listened to the evidence of Les Brown, you say you weren't aware of any issues relating to Dr. Karch, as you recall. And then paragraph 53, I have no recollection of the issues referred to. And again, this relates to sorry, I can't see that. Leave that aside for one
53
moment.
is about consultations, I think.
Would you have expected there to be something in the papers you were sent explaining the background of Dr. Karch, and would that have been helpful to you to know from the very beginning?
I think it would have been helpful to know from the very beginning the full extent of the issues. I think now looking back, as I went through the process, I was aware that Dr. Karch was an outlier, that his opinion was not in line with the other opinions that we had, that he might be giving opinions that he was not qualified to give. I don't recall if I knew that about the content of the article in the newspaper and the particular issues surrounding the independence. But yes, it might have been helpful to have it in writing when the report was forwarded to me, but I don't think it would have changed how I approached it, because I would still have analysed it myself. Obviously, if the Lord Advocate had, of the time, had indicated that he had concerns about that report, then I would take that on board. But I will also take on board the fact that at the time those comments were made, it was not a very earlier stage of the investigation, that by the time I was coming to my Crown Counsel's instructions, I had a lot more information. And so, although I would have taken those viewpoints on board, I would have still looked at it myself independently. Having gone back to the actual report, which from the precognition I see that I've put comments in it. I don't know at what time I've added those, but certainly in parts of the conclusions I've made my own annotations in the actual report.
Right. Can I ask you to look at, and you will already be aware of this from the evidence of Les Brown, can I ask you to look at COPFS 04881, and this is an email chain between you and Les Brown, which we asked Les Brown about during the evidence. Can we go to the, often we have to go to the bottom of these to see them in chronological order. So this was originally an email from Fiona Carnan about an OST expert, and then if we move up, and that was sent to Les Brown and others, and then you have responded to that again about the OST expert. If we can move up again, please.
I think perhaps that email explains the approach that you'd asked me about in with regard to another expert, is that we're making sure that the experts have the full information.
Thank you. And then we can move up. And then you see there's an email from Les Brown on the 19th of January 2018. And he said, responding to you, many thanks, Ashley. I've copied others into the chain here. And he talks about a document. I suggest that we remove all reference to Dr. Karch on the basis that the previous LE indicated to Amar Anwar that we would not be relying on him following his comments to a newspaper. In respect of the officer down comment, I suggest, and he goes on to mention another matter. Your response to that?
And can I just highlight that that's in the January of 2018, so
Yes.
this is at the time that we've nearly got the final recognition, and I'm already thinking about consultations with experts
Yes.
and coming to my final CCI.
And he's saying there, I suggest we remove all reference to Dr. Karch. Do you remember? And then let's look at your response first of all. And this is on the same day you reply to Les Brown, I agree. In any event, his histological analysis of the heart muscle is at odds with the rest of the experts and calls into question his reliability on other matters. So it appears that Les Brown had drawn this to your attention in the January of 2018, if not before. And if we go back down to his email, he says, I suggest we remove all reference to Dr. Karch, and mentions Lord Advocate's views. From what was he suggesting removing all reference to Dr. Karch?
If we're talking about I thought actually at this point we were talking about the letter to Dr. Lawler, and we're not, we're talking about the OST expert. So my recollection was that Dr. Karch's report went to Dr. Lawler.
Yes.
But here, Les is recommending that we don't put in Dr. Karch's report to the OST expert, and I agreed with that.
Right. So it was
because he's not a medical expert, so he really would have no value, and it would just confuse matters.
So Martin Greaves is not a medical expert, and it wouldn't be appropriate to send him a medical report from Dr. Karch, because any comments Martin Greaves had in relation to medical matters would be of no value to the Crown.
And might simply muddy the waters. It might give us a skewed view, and it wasn't part of the, if you like, by that stage, the Crown theory. It was something Dr. Karcher's report required to be dealt with in properly analysed, but with regard to the actual actus reus, which was important for the OST expert, then his report was not of value.
Thank you. And when we asked Les Brown about Dr. Karch in his report, he said, we had a situation whereby Dr. Karch was expressing an opinion that it was entirely at odds with every other opinion that had been expressed. So to that extent, I consider that is partly why I expressed my view that I think it's highly unlikely that Crown Counsel would have placed any reliance on the evidence of the opinion of Dr. Karch. And you, subject to your comments about requiring to deal with that report, would you agree with Les Brown's evidence?
Yes, I'd already come to my own view with regard to that particular opinion by that particular expert and how it fitted with the rest of the medical evidence.
Thank you. Can we look at your statement, first of all, paragraph 21. And here you comment on reading one of your notebooks. So this was in your initial statement, your response to the inquiry. So you had access to some paperwork at that stage?
The inquiry sent me documents. So the inquiry sent me documents which I think they had understood were relevant to the questions that were being asked, and it was only those documents that I used.
And one of those was, or you had a number of notebooks made available to you at that time from the inquiry?
No, I just had the copies. So I just had the pages. I didn't have the full notebooks. I just had, and sometimes not even the full page, just a paragraph or sometimes just a line.
And that would be entries that related specifically to the Sheku Bio investigation.
Entries that related specifically to the questions that were being asked. So I wasn't able to see the entries that were round about it or give them context.
And you've talked about looking at page numbers. You talk about seeing a to-do list. From the expert reports, it can be seen that Dr. Karch has a contrary view to all the other cardiovascular experts, and this can be seen from item number 10, where I have asked, or been asked, that Dr. Lawler be asked about Dr. Karch's findings, and this was a process that we went through with all the other relevant experts. So you say, item number 10, I have asked that Dr. Lawler be asked about Dr. Karch's findings. And again, was this with a purpose and with a view to exploring Dr. Karch's opinion, in case it had to be responded to by some sort of trial?
Yes.
So this was specifically trial preparation, in effect.
It was not trial preparation. It was investigating all potential contrary views, everything that might be an issue with regard to me making that decision on criminality.
And did you feel that Dr. Lawler was the right expert to ask about Dr. Karch's opinions and views?
He was the expert that we were instructed for that whole process, and you'll see that I'm asking about the conclusions of Dr. Karch. And again, if Dr. Lawler, in his expertise with his qualifications, felt he couldn't answer that question, then the answer is I can't answer it, and that again is fine.
Did you feel that you had a clear picture in your mind at that time as to what qualifications and expertise Dr. Karch had?
I can't remember because I can't tell you what time that was, or because we don't know the date on the notebook, and in fact it may not even have a date, so I don't know. I don't know whether this was made at the beginning of a process. It's certainly after Dr. Lawler's been instructed, but I can't remember when in the process Dr. Lawler was instructed.
And during your consultation with Dr. Lawler, do you remember exploring in any detail the issues with Dr. Karch or discussing with him those matters as part of this process of reviewing the value of Dr. Karch's opinions and issues with his report?
That might have been something I asked about because obviously this was an area of concern. I can't remember, but that may well be of something that I would have asked.
There's certainly mention in the consultation notes of Dr. Karch. At the end, Dr. Lawler was asked whether his views and opinions would alter if the reports by Dr. Karch were discounted. That's the mention of Dr. Karch. Was that part of a wider discussion by you at the time?
I suspect it will be. Those notes obviously weren't kept by me, and there will be a summary of the points that we discussed. It won't be the full conversation.
Thank you. Can we move on to look at another matter? So in 2018, you've described how at some point you received the Crown Recognition in the early part of that year, and the inquiry has information and evidence available that in the May of 2018, Professor David Rees and Dr. Elizabeth Solyu were instructed, and they were histopathologists. And in addition, on the 29th of May, that a Dr. Sebastian Lucas was instructed. So in that period, around about April, May 2018, there was a haematologist instructed and 2 histopathologists, and that related to blood, and as I understand it, that was an exploration of the issue of sickle cell. Now, do you remember if that arose after you'd received the Crown Recognition or before you'd received the Crown Recognition?
I don't remember. I do remember the issue being raised. My recollection was Dr. Solyu had already been instructed at an earlier stage and there was a supplementary report?
She did a number of reports, that's correct.
So I think that might have been prior to the May of 2018, and we were following up on some issues from her original report.
I am interested in the issue about sickle cell. We've heard evidence already about sickle cell trait, sickle cell disease, and we've heard evidence in that regard. But I'm interested in some of the matters that you raised yesterday. And yesterday you talked about a number of things in relation to sickle cell. You talked about Afro-Caribbeans, you talked about a connection, you talked about the origins of the name of Mr. Shekubayo. And you made a number of comments. You mentioned Creole and various other matters. In relation to sickle cell, were you responsible for instructing that line of investigation, either through the team or otherwise?
I think from my recollection, it was raised initially with the cardiologist. One of the cardiologists brought it up and it indicated that we should look at that further. And
was that then explored further? And was that done by the team or was it done by you in consultation?
The experts, we instructed the experts as a result of one expert saying, I'm seeing something here, I think you should look at that. I think the team did try and instruct an expert. We got an expert who then said, you need somebody else to look at this. And the team thereafter identified that somebody else. I consulted, I think, with the cardiologist and ultimately the expert in sickle cell.
Right. Now, we have consultation notes in relation to Dr. Solyu, and there's no mention of you being present at that consultation. Were you actually present?
No, if there's no mention, then I wasn't present. I had a memory that I did consult with that doctor, but that's maybe incorrect. It may be simply that the team consulted or took a precognition and then reported back to me. I did speak to a lot of doctors. I did a number of trips down south to consult, and my memory was that I had spoken to her, but perhaps not.
Right. So that could be a mistake. In relation to the specific issues regarding the origins of Mr. Bayo's family or his name or any of those matters, did you instruct a line of investigation where the family were approached and asked to provide some perhaps relevant background or history to the Crown to then provide that history to the experts?
No, and my answer to you yesterday was in response to the issue that I had recalled that Mr. Bayo was Afro-Caribbean, and that's where my memory, without the full case papers, I recalled he was from Sierra Leone, but there was a memory with regard to the academic paper that I'd looked at.
And what was the source of this academic paper that you looked at?
We got it from one of the experts. I think the last expert.
And would that be Lucas?
I think so.
And that is the source of your information?
Yes, and that's why I gave you the explanation yesterday as to why I recalled that Mr. Bayo was Afro-Caribbean. I knew he was from Sierra Leone, but that there had been a connection between the prevalence of the sickle cell traits and the sickle cell gene in the Afro-Caribbean population, and I recalled reading that academic paper.
Did you consult with Lucas?
I think so, but I'm not sure. I certainly consulted with one of the experts with regard to sickle cell, but I'm not sure I consulted with them both, because I think there was two. Was it a man or a woman you consulted with? It was a man.
So you think you may have consulted with Lucas?
Yes.
Did you specifically ask him about the paper, the academic paper, in relation to a connection between sickle cell and Afro-Caribbean?
No, I don't think so. I think he just gave that to me, or it was part of his report and I read it.
I am trying to understand why you were left with the impression that Mr. Bio was Afro-Caribbean. Given you've explained you had an academic paper, but no contact whatsoever with the family, no information from the family, and no detailed recollection of any discussion of this point with one of the experts, perhaps Dr. Lucas.
That was my attempt to explain why I had an imperfect memory. So I thought that is what the expert had finally said. That was my memory, and it was incorrect. Even in my memory in giving the statement, I recalled that he was from Sierra Leone, but that was the reason I mentioned Afro-Caribbean, and that was simply a result of an imperfect memory without the full papers. So it wasn't anything that was explored at the time. I do remember that there was an issue with regard to disclosure of the report, because we were concerned about what we had found with regard to the sickle cell gene. And we were concerned that that was important information that should be given to the family. And we were also concerned that that should be conveyed sensitively to the family. And so I remember quite a lot of discussion and emails about that.
Do you remember that Dr. Solyu, the female histopathologist, had read the academic report and tore it apart?
No. And that's, again, that wasn't the point of me mentioning it. It wasn't that I was making any particular reliance on it. I just had remembered reading it.
Did you consider that Dr. Solyu had been asked to comment on the publication and the comments made within it in relation to post-mortem red blood cells, sickling, and described it as justice authorities have misused sickle cell trait to try and explain away 10 sudden deaths often associated with forced restraint of African Caribbean people in custody?
I don't remember discussing the report with her. I don't even know if I'd read it before there was a consultation. You've told me that I wasn't at it, but I don't remember that.
You hadn't read the academic report, or you hadn't read the comments by Dr. Solyu?
Were those comments in her report?
You said you hadn't read it. I'm just trying to work out what it was you hadn't read.
I can't tell you whether I'd read the report or not. And you're telling me I didn't consult with Dr. Solyu, so I couldn't possibly have discussed it with her.
We have a consultation note for Dr. Solyu. You're not mentioned on it. But I was asking you whether you had consulted.
So the answer about the report is I can't remember whether she discussed it in her report to the investigation. So her medical opinion, I can't remember if that was discussed.
Let me help you with that. I have a report in front of me from Dr. Solyu, a supplementary report dated the 10th of May 2018. And as part of that, she comments on a publication about sickle cell trait in the criminal justice system. It's page 15 of the report, paragraph 21 for those behind me. I've been asked in particular to comment on a publication, she gives the details, because of its comments on post-mortem red blood cell sickling. It claims that sickle cell trait is a genetic carrier state and not an illness. She goes on to say, and I'm summarising the entire report, justice authorities have misused sickle cell trait to explain away 10 sudden deaths, often associated with forced restraint of African Caribbean people in custody. And without going into a lot of detail about the comments on African Caribbeans, do you have a recollection of reading that report and being concerned about the academic paper and being concerned about the references in the academic paper to African Caribbeans and wondering whether this had any relevance to Mr. Bio?
I remember the line of investigation And if we've gone back to Dr. Solyu, then I was obviously concerned because I've asked her to comment about it.
And given those concerns, and given the complete lack of information that anyone had from the family about the history and the background of the Bio family, and Mr. Bio in particular, did you have concerns about the relevance of any of that to Mr. Bio and his situation?
Obviously there were concerns, because that's why we've asked the expert to report again and to tell us about it and to help us with the publication. And I think, as I recall, we followed the evidence further because we asked for another expert to look at it, just so that we could be sure that we had a clear picture of what the experts were saying.
And yesterday, when you gave evidence that you'd done some research about the country and that you had, following a consultation with the expert, either Lucas or Solyu, regarding sickle cell, and looking at an academic paper, and you then went on to describe the recessive gene in the Afro-Caribbean population, that had been discussed. Your recollection was you'd done research in relation to the makeup of the population in Sierra Leone, and there was a significant proportion of Afro-Caribbeans in Sierra Leone because of the way the country had come into being. And in relation to that answer, is it fair to say that in light of what you've told us now, that perhaps the position was not as clear-cut as perhaps the answer yesterday indicated?
My answer to that is that my answer yesterday was an explanation of why I had recalled Mr. Bio was Afro-Caribbean. Once I had the papers, I realised that there was much more detail about that. I hadn't forgotten that he was from Sierra Leone, but that was the connection I'd made in my mind 6 or 7 years later. I do recall that there was quite significant detail gone into with regard to sickle cell. I recall that it was a gap in my own knowledge, that I hadn't appreciated that it was a recessive gene, and that you could have, even if you were just a carrier, that you could have some of the symptoms in particular situations. So I remember being quite interested in following that and understanding that from the expert. But the explanation I gave you yesterday was an explanation as to why it was in my original statement, not an explanation of anything that I had done particularly at the time.
And yesterday, when you said, you mentioned specifically Mr. Bio's name and said that could be considered to have some sort of Creole influences, what was the basis for you saying that? Was it something from a report, something from a document that you'd seen or remembered?
No, it was nothing to do with the original investigation. It was only my explanation as to why I had remembered that.
And where did you personally obtain the information about a connection or a possible connection between the name of the family and Creole influences?
From my own general knowledge, the bio is a Creole word.
And where did
bio is a Creole word. That's.
Do you have personal experience of Creole and the names and origins of people?
No, just from my general knowledge. That was simply an explanation as to why I had put that in my statement. Nothing more.
And without that personal experience, where did your general knowledge come from in relation to the names of families and their derivations, their origins?
I don't understand what you're asking me. Where did my general knowledge come from? It comes from...
Specifically in relation to this point, not just generally.
It just comes from my general knowledge of the usage of the name. It was, I suspect, a further explanation as to why in my memory I had made that link. But it's not something that I looked at the time. It's not something that featured at the time.
So it's not information that was based on any communication or details from the family themselves, not information based on any expert report or academic paper, and effectively it was something you know from what you describe as your general knowledge.
And not something I'd made a link on at the time. This is only subsequently when I was giving my explanation to you yesterday as to why I'd put that in my statement. So not even something that was thought about at the time. It's not a connection I made at the time of the investigation.
So something that you have provided as an explanation yesterday in relation to events some time ago.
No, an explanation yesterday in relation to making my statement a few months ago.
Thank you.
So absolutely no connection to the investigation at the time.
Thank you. Given that background, would you perhaps feel more comfortable, given that those comments weren't based on any report or academic finding or otherwise, perhaps feel more comfortable if you withdrew those comments, insofar as they may cause any issue for the family of Mr. Bio in particular?
100%. If it caused any upset or distress, that was not my intention, and I would absolutely withdraw them. And I would confirm that it's not something that featured in my decision making at the time, or I even thought about it.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you about, we've spoken about Dr. Lucas and Dr. Solu, and I'm interested in whether you explored, either by instructing a line of investigation with the team or yourself, if you had a consultation with either of them, whether you explored their qualifications, because we have heard that it is of significance that the pathologists involved were forensic pathologists, and that views and opinions should be expressed through that prism of forensic pathology. Now, did you explore with either Lucas or Solu, or through the team, the nature of their qualifications? Because we have heard that Sebastian Lucas is a non-forensic pathologist, and he was very upfront about that in his report. And Dr. Solu was also a general pathologist, not a forensic pathologist. And we can't find anything in the paperwork that suggests that that aspect of their qualifications was explored in any way, either by you or the team. And I'm wondering if you have a recollection of this.
I don't have a recollection of exploring that. I do recall that this issue came quite late in the day, and so we were looking...
The sickle cell issue?
Yes. So we were looking really to investigate that as much as possible in the time that we had. Because by this time, my recollection is we had started consulting, and really this was an issue that had been raised and required to be further investigated. I don't recall the initial report for Dr. Solu, but I'm not sure that we had any concerns about her qualifications with regard to her specific expertise. I'm sure that when she was identified, and again I don't recall what stage she was identified at, that we would have had her CV, the team would have looked at her qualifications. You tell me that there was a consultation with Dr. Solu and I was not present. It may be.
I don't know if you were present, as I said.
Okay.
You're not named, but I didn't know if you were there.
Okay. Well, and I can't remember. If somebody else took the notes, then I would have thought that they were accurate notes of a consultation. If I was responsible for taking the notes, I might say to you that is definitely something I could have missed off. But if it was somebody else's notes, I would have said that they were accurately and properly taken. So whether the consultation with Dr. Solu took the form of a more traditional consultation for going into a precognition, where you follow the format and you check with you follow the precognoser's handbook, you check with the expert the initial qualifications, all that is recorded in a particular formula, and thereafter it's sent back to the expert agrees or disagrees, amends as appropriate, signs it and sends it back. So that's the kind of document that I would expect if there was a traditional consultation precognition for Crown Counsel. If it's something else where I've asked for something to be investigated and bottomed out, then I wouldn't necessarily expect it to go through that process, because they're going back to the expert with a particular aim.
There's evidence available to the chair from a number of sources. For example, Dr. Carey commented on Dr. Solyu in his inquiry statement to the inquiry. He knew Dr. Solyu, and he said, "This is a pure forensic kind of death, and it's important to realise that she should never have been instructed to be the primary pathologist investigating this death under the coronial system, coroner system down in England, or I suspect under the fiscal system." And Dr. Shearer similarly said, "My understanding is that Dr. Solyu is a general pathologist, not a forensic pathologist. And I'm not sure if she undertakes restraint cases and drug deaths." In fact, with Sebastian Lucas, Dr. Shearer said he was a non-forensic pathologist, and in relation to restraint, he says, "The last feature, struggle against restraint, can include positional asphyxia. But as a non-forensic pathologist, I do not wish to be drawn into a more detailed discussion in that area." And I wondered whether there's nothing in the consultation notes with Dr. Solyu to suggest that this area was explored, to see to what extent the comments about sickle cell and the opinions expressed had an impact in relation to consideration of the events at Hayfield Road, primarily the restraint. And I'm wondering if that's something that you instructed the precognosers to look into and they simply didn't, or if it's something that was missed.
You'll have to remind me if my memory is not correct, but Dr. Solyu was the cardiologist, is that right?
Histopathologist.
With a particular interest in cardiology?
I can check over the next break, but my understanding was that in relation to sickle cell, she was being asked with her expertise on histopathology. But I can check that. I'm conscious of the time anyway, and this might be an opportunity to give me a chance to look at that.
Right, we'll take the break now then, 20 minutes. That's great.
Thank you. Just before the break, we were talking about Dr. Solyu, and I can confirm, I said I would check over the break, and Dr. Solyu, in her original expert report, had provided a summary and a detailed CV, an appendix as part of her report, where she said at that time, and this was page 38, from March 2008 to the present, she was consultant histopathologist with a special interest in hematopathology and post-mortem pathology. She described herself as an academic clinical pathologist, not as a forensic pathologist, and the front page of her report described herself as a consultant pathologist, again not as a forensic pathologist. So it would appear that that information was available within the body of her first report, and I had been asking if that issue about the lack of forensic experience in relation to Dr. Solyu and Dr. Lucas regarding blood and sickle cell had been explored in any way by you or by the team, because we had nothing to suggest that that had ever been discussed with them, and yet the evidence available to the inquiry and available to the chair is that this is something significant, because they do not consider things through the prism of forensic pathology.
Okay, before I answer that question, can I just repeat what I said before the
Please
break about what was said in my statement and the matters that we were discussing before the break? And can I just repeat that if anything I said about that matter did cause the family upset, then they have my heartfelt apology. So before I answer that question, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So can we move back now to the issue in relation to the question of the qualifications and experience of the experts in relation to histopathology and the lack of forensic experience that they had, and whether that had been explored?
I don't remember. I do remember getting the issue being raised, and my recollection was that the issue was raised with the cardiologist or one of the other experts, which led us to another expert, which led us to another expert. So I don't recall we're going through the process of us actually looking and searching for the experts, looking at CVs, going through that process earlier on in the investigation.
But at the point you were involved and thinking about consultations with the experts, conducting consultations with the experts, and looking into this issue particularly of sickle cell, did you investigate and explore this issue of effectively, again, the weight or the value of comments and opinions that you were being given in the context of the job you were doing?
By the time those experts in that line of investigation was followed through, I'd already started the consultation process in my recollection. If you're talking about May of 2018, I definitely had started that process, if I'd not even completed perhaps all of them apart from the OST expert. I was relying on the experts that we did have to give us an indication of who might be able to assist us in the questions that we had, and thereafter getting that expert, getting the CVs, and if they had dealt with the area that we were looking at, then being satisfied at that stage. I think in my mind at the time, I simply wanted to bottom that piece of evidence out, or that area of investigation out. As we went through it, I didn't think it had the potential to change the view that I was already coming to with regard to the causal link. But I felt that it was important that we followed things through.
Thank you. Can I move on now, please, to the consultation with Dr. Bleetman? And we mentioned him earlier. He was a consultant in emergency medicine. And we have consultation notes available to the inquiry which show that you were present at that consultation with Les Brown
I do remember that consultation, and it was in Scotland House, I think, in London.
And it was on the 9th of May 2018.
So I think, as I indicated earlier, then the process of consultation had already started in the May of 2018.
I'm interested in, again, in the issue of the ability and capacity of Dr. Bleatman to give you the opinion that you were seeking from the purposes of the Crown. Now, the limits of his expertise and how far he was prepared to express a view, did you, and his qualifications and his experience, did you explore that at the consultation with Dr. Bleatman? And just so you know, there's no reference in the consultation notes to any of this being discussed with Dr. Bleatman.
I think I was aware of his qualifications prior to the consultation. I recollect there being some discussion about trying to identify the correct expert. We weren't entirely sure that we'd got to the correct expert, but from what was available to us, my recollection is he was the closest match. I recall asking him about his experience and his qualifications. I do recall that he was a doctor in emergency medicine, is that correct?
That's correct.
And that he had had some involvement with regard to some government guidelines and practices. I wasn't sure that he was entirely a good fit, and my recollection is that when I was speaking to him at consultation, there were areas that he strayed into that perhaps I thought that he ought not to, and my recollection is that I made a note of that for myself. If he was subsequently going to be used as a witness, that he would have to be quite carefully controlled as a witness so that he didn't stray into areas that were beyond his expertise. So that is my recollection of the consultation with Dr. Bleatman.
I think in fairness to you, there is a note within the consultation notes that he had worked with patients with extreme agitation and psychosis. So it may be that that was part of a conversation about his experience.
Yes. Yeah.
You say you had a concern that he strayed on occasion into areas perhaps he ought not to. What do you mean by that?
Just out with his area of expertise, perhaps during the consultation had given me some opinions with regard to, I can't remember particular examples, but that is the impression I recall.
Right. His resume, which was part of his report, said he was qualified as a police instructor for unarmed defensive tactics, safe prisoner restraint, communication skills, sprays and defence. And in his letter of instruction, he was asked to comment on whether in all the circumstances the restraint was appropriate and whether the officers who arrested and detained the deceased adhered to police standard operating procedures on restraint and use of force. Were those, although that was in his letter of instruction, were your concerns that he was simply not qualified to express a view on those matters,
Yes.
being a consultant in emergency medicine?
Yes, and that's why we then led, I think, to get the OST expert. That was the more appropriate expert to ask those questions.
Right. Certainly, we have an inquiry statement from Dr. Bleatman that's available to the chair, and he said he was not prepared to provide an opinion on the mechanics of the restraint, whether the use of force was reasonable, proportionate or necessary. It would be for a use of force expert to comment on the restraint. He said, I believe that I challenged the substance of instruction in a phone call, indicating that I did not want to get involved with the use of force issue. I think there was likely to have been a phone call in which I advised that I did not want to deal with the issue of lawfulness of the restraint or anything to do with compliance with police procedures, guidelines and training. This was not within my area of expertise. I perhaps should have written in my report that I would deal with the medical implications of use of force, but not with other elements of the case. Was that call with you? No.
No, I didn't speak to any of the experts directly, so it won't have been with me. And I didn't liaise with him in advance. I wasn't responsible for organising the consultation.
Was it before the consultation, was it drawn to your attention that he had challenged the substance of his instructions and indicated he did not want to get involved with the use of force issue?
I don't remember that. That might have happened, but I don't recall it.
Had you been aware that that was his position in advance of the consultation, would you even have addressed the issue of restraint or other matters like that with him, on the basis that he had said he did not want to get involved with that issue and he could not deal with the issue of lawfulness, it was not within his area of expertise?
I don't remember specifically what I was interested in from him, but I obviously, from the instruction of the OST expert, I agreed with his position and it wasn't sufficient for my purposes.
Right. Again, we've looked at the consultation notes and it does not appear that there was any discussion of Mr. Bio's medical injuries, their mechanism, other than the rib injury, which was not causative of death. There is a discussion on restraint, but not in connection with the application of weight during the restraint by any officer lying on Mr. Bio's body. And there's no mention of the use of baton blows to the head. There's no discussion about potential injuries in relation to that. Why were those medical matters not discussed with, or were they discussed with Dr. Bleekman, but just simply not noted in the consultation notes?
I can't remember. I think I was just interested in his experience within his sphere, which was in emergency medicine, with acute behavioural disturbances and how he would deal with them in the hospital setting. So that, my recollection as I sit here now, that was what I was interested in from him.
So the focus of your consultation with him did not relate to the injuries per se of themselves, or the application of weight or the baton blows?
No. But I do remember he did have a background of policing or something to do with the use of weapons or tasers or something like that.
I think I indicated at the outset that his resume, which was included with his report, said he was qualified as a police instructor for unarmed defensive tactics involving restraint, communication skills, incapacitant sprays, that type of thing.
I think by the time of the consultation, I was satisfied that that's not someone that was going to give me the answers with regard to that I needed.
Right. I'd like to talk about Dr. Shearer. We've spoken about her already today. You consulted with her not until the 4th of June 2018. We have consultation notes available to us, and you attended that consultation according to the notes with Alistair MacLeod. Do you remember that consultation?
Can you remind me who Dr. Shearer was, which speciality she was in?
She was the pathologist that we've spoken about who conducted the post-mortem.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Shearer, excuse me, and Dr. Buhadir.
Okay, of course.
I'd like to ask you about the information that was available to Dr. Shearer and just check some information that we have. Now, we know from the Precognoser's Handbook that an expert must be given all necessary and relevant information to enable them to provide an opinion of the injuries to the deceased. And you have talked about that in your evidence yesterday and this morning. And we have heard evidence that Ashley Wise's statement was transcribed inaccurately.
I recall
and there
that.
was, and do you remember that?
I do.
You'll remember that we spoke to other witnesses about this. And part of the paragraph that, although these were anonymised when they were sent to the experts, part of the paragraph that was absent and omitted from the statement of Ashley Wise related to at least 6 police officers lying on top of Mr. Bio, crossing over him from both sides, covering his whole body, It was only when they moved, the witness said she could see his arm, and she definitely knew that it was a black man. It looked like one officer was using a baton to hold the man down. It was on his upper chest towards his throat. Now, we understand that that information was omitted from the statement that was originally sent to Dr. Shearer.
I think it was omitted from a number of expert reports.
Yes.
That's the piece of information that I recall, that there was subsequently a finding by the Crown that when the team was checking, when Alistair MacLeod was checking, that there had been something missed out from the statement, and that the experts that had been initially instructed all had the same statement.
And we have asked witnesses about that, and we have documentation available to the inquiry that indicates that a number of witnesses were then sent a complete version of Ashley Wise's statement.
I saw that from the correspondence that I now have access to. I didn't see it in Les Brown's evidence, but I saw it in the material that I have.
It was other witnesses I asked. But the inquiry doesn't have any record of Crown Office writing to Dr. Shearer and Bouhadir to seek their opinion on the matter and to provide a complete copy. And I just wonder, in terms of your consultation with Dr. Shearer, if you recollect discussing that paragraph and that aspect, when there is mention in the consultation notes of the use of a baton. Do you remember raising this with Dr. Shearer at the consultation?
I don't remember raising the issue of a different statement. That was much earlier in the investigation. I would have expected that all the experts were given the proper statement. That was my understanding, and it looks to me like the correspondence confirms that. Was I asking about potentially a baton? I think so, because I wanted to investigate that. I was aware that there was some information that the baton was applied to Mr. Bayo's upper arm, but other witnesses were talking about up near the chest area, and that's certainly something that I would want to explore.
And is that something you did explore with Dr. Shearer? Even if you didn't mention the Ashley Wise statement?
I think so.
Yeah.
It will have been one of the injuries that I was interested, or potential areas of injury that I was interested in.
At any time did you confirm that the full Ashley Wise statement, the complete version, had been sent to Dr. Shearer?
I don't think I would have checked up. I think I would have noted that there was an issue. I would have seen the correspondence coming in. I would have seen the reason for the issue. It was quite a significant part of the statement, so that raised suspicions in our minds. I was also aware that there was concern that the original experts hadn't had a full picture because that was missing from the statements, and I was aware that there was then to be an effort for all the witnesses or all the experts to get the correct information. I wouldn't have double checked that that had happened.
Can I ask you about another aspect of the information available to Dr. Shearer and Dr. Bouhadir? We've heard evidence about the weight of a number of the officers, the height and weight of the officers. We are aware that, initially at least, the weights of the officers were not provided to the pathologists as part of the factual matrix. And it's not clear from the documentation we have if Dr. Shearer was aware of the weights of the officers. And as I say, we have documentation, but we can't confirm that that was provided to her. Looking at the consultation notes as we have, again, we can't see any reference in those to the weights of the officers having been discussed. And you'll know yourself, and we'll come on to this later, that it was evidence available to the Crown that perhaps one of the officers was lying on or at the side of Mr. Bayo. Do you remember now whether you discussed that specific issue with Dr. Shearer?
I don't, but I do remember questioning the weight of one of the officers because I saw it in print early on, and I think it was 24 or 25 stone. I've again seen in my notation in some of the papers where I've underlined 25 stone and I've got a question mark against it. I don't know whether it's in the pathology report or whether it's in one of the other documents, but certainly it's an issue that I was concerned about, and I asked for confirmation whether that was correct. I thought it might have been a typo.
We've heard evidence that that was correct. It was 25 stone. It wasn't a typo. But we have evidence to suggest that the weights of the officers were not provided to Dr. Shearer and Dr. Buhadir. I wondered if you remember any, you've obviously explored the issue to some extent with your team. You've considered the weight, but did you discuss that at a consultation with Dr. Shearer?
I can't remember.
If it's not in the consultation notes, is it likely you didn't raise that specifically with Dr. Shearer?
It's potentially correct, but I suspect what I would have asked the officers, particularly when I'll ask the witness, particularly when I'm putting individual allegations with regard to batons, I think I would have gone through that process of asking her about all the different potential positions of the officers, potential infliction of wounds, and whether we would expect to see something or not. Whether I specifically mentioned 25 stone, I can't remember.
All right. Can I ask you now about toxicology? I think, as my understanding of the evidence is that Dr. Shearer was of the view that a toxicologist would have been the best person to speak to the effects of MDMA and alpha PVP. And it was a qualified toxicologist that would have been in a position to provide assistance in regard to the impact and the effect that that can have on a person's body. My understanding is that both drugs could cause sudden death due to cardiac arrhythmias.
And I think you showed me that in the post-mortem report this morning.
Did you consider consulting with Dr. Edelstein, who was a toxicologist?
Is he the pharmacologist and toxicologist?
A toxicologist, yes, and I think he was also a pharmacologist.
I chose the experts to consult with on the areas which I didn't understand, or I felt that there was a gap in my knowledge. If there was enough in the particular report, then I didn't necessarily need to consult with that expert. I have a background in pharmacology. My first degree is in pharmacology, so I was probably happy I understood his report.
Now, we've heard evidence that alpha PVP was relatively unknown, if I can summarise it in that way, in Scotland at the time. And we've heard evidence from PERC witnesses, such as Mr. McSporran, who was the lead investigator, that that was not something that they were familiar with. And they wanted to seek expert views on that to assist their information. Are you saying that you actually knew more about alpha PVP and ecstasy because of your background in pharmacology?
Not more than the expert, absolutely not. My recollection is that PERC did have some expert that commented on that, but the qualifications weren't in place. And my recollection was that I had input into saying, well, this is one of the directions that we need clarified.
Well, we've certainly heard evidence that some of those involved thought Dr. Karch was a qualified toxicologist, and were under the impression that he would be able to provide that evidence. We've also heard other evidence that he has no from Dr. Karch's inquiry statement himself, that he has no formal toxicology qualifications. But we know that Dr. Edelstein was instructed by the Crown and produced a report, and he was a qualified toxicologist. And I wonder why you decided not to consult with him.
I probably decided that at that stage I didn't need anything further, that I was satisfied that I had enough information. That's not to say it wouldn't have been good to consult with them, but I had to choose the things, the people that I had time and to consult with, and the ability to go down south and make the consultations, and also whether the expert was available. I understand there's a couple of experts who I tried to see who weren't available at the time, and I wasn't able to consult with them.
Who were they?
I think it was Dr. Shepherd.
Mary Shepherd.
I think so.
And anyone else?
I remember seeing an email that said, can we make arrangements for Dr. Shepherd? And my recollection is that that wasn't possible.
Any other
Unless you tell
expert?
me that I have seen Dr. Shepherd, which also is entirely possible.
No, I don't think that she is on the list of experts that you saw.
Okay.
In relation to the comment you make about not having maybe time to consult or not being able to arrange a consultation because of experts' availability, in relation to the time, what pressure were you under in relation to time to, if you thought an expert would have assisted you in your understanding of the circumstances, was that not something that you wanted to ensure you conducted?
If I really thought I needed to see the expert in order to understanding, then I would have made time and done it, even if it had to be at the weekend or on a Sunday night, that kind of thing. As long as I could fit in with the expert, I would have travelled wherever it was necessary and consulted with that expert.
So even though Dr. Shearer, the pathologist, said the best person to speak to would be a toxicologist, and Dr. Edelston was a toxicologist, you felt that your own general knowledge and background of pharmacology, your degree in that, was provided sufficient information in relation to MDMA and alpha PVP and the impact that has on a person.
My recollection is that we had the toxicology report, and I had that expert report, so I had his report. It's just I didn't need to consult to clarify anything in my mind, so it's not that I substituted my own knowledge for the expert, it's simply that I had enough information from that expert report.
Thank you. We have an inquiry statement from Dr. Edelston. I hope I'm not offending. He may be a professor. I'm sorry.
I think he might be.
I think he may be a professor. He has given an inquiry statement to the chair. It is my opinion on the balance of probabilities that but for Mr. Byles' encounter with the police that morning and the subsequent restraint, he would not have died. And I'm interested in whether you explored the possibility with Professor Edelston whether but for the restraint he would have died. Was that something that was clear to you from your reading of his report?
By the time I was coming to the end of the investigation and my conclusions, I think I was already satisfied or becoming satisfied that the but-for test was satisfied. So that was establishing the causal link.
So you were satisfied that but for the restraint he would not have died?
I think I was coming to that conclusion. In fact, even if I was not completely satisfied, as I said to you yesterday, I could see that there was a strong argument that I could put before a court to say that there was a causal link.
Thank you. Can I ask you one last matter in relation to Mr. Byles' mental health? I wondered whether you instructed any lines of investigation through the team or whether you yourself expressed an interest in exploring the issues of mental health, Mr. Byles' mental health and that aspect.
I don't remember, but I think we would have potentially explored any mental health history. In my recollection, I don't recall that there was any specific mental health history, but that might be an incorrect recollection.
Right. Did you consider at any stage instructing an expert to specifically look into the issue of mental health?
Do you mean a history of mental health?
Well, did you investigate an investigation both into the history and then to ask an expert to give an opinion on mental health issues?
I can't remember what the answer was to was there a mental health history. I do remember having some details, but I can't remember whether that was specifically targeted at mental health. If there had been anything in the history, then I think I would have asked for more information, because there would have been something, if there had been contact with mental health services, then there would have been records, and we could have had an expert look at those records. I don't remember that to be the case.
Thank you. Can I ask you about some evidence that we've heard from Les Brown about consultation notes? Now, the inquiry has a number of consultation notes available that relate to consultations with the experts. And I asked Mr. Brown a number of questions about those. I said that we'd have no record of a consultation with Dr. John Parks, and I asked if he remembered whether there had been a consultation that we simply didn't have the records of, and he said no. Do you remember having any consultation with Dr. Parks?
Can you remind me who he is, what he spoke to, and where he was based? Because those things help me. I remember going to different cities and consulting. So if you could tell me where he was based.
I will have to find that in my notes, but I will do that. Maurice Lipsitch, we've talked about him already. He was the consultant psychiatrist. We don't have any notes of you consulting with Dr. Lipsitch. And do you remember any consultations with him? Les Brown's evidence was that no, there was no consultation with him. Do you have any different recollection from Les Brown?
I don't think so.
I asked Mr. Brown about a consultation with Dr. Lucas and asked him if he remembered a consultation with Dr. Lucas. Now, you said you thought you had consulted.
I remember going to one of the big London hospitals, and I recall quite a short consultation. Now, it may be that that short consultation was with the expert that came in between the two. There was someone that we were directed to by, I think, Dr. Solow.
There was a Dr. Rees also included at one point.
All right. Well, it might have been that doctor, because there was a doctor that we had a very short consultation with who said, actually, I can't help you, but you could maybe go to
I think that may have been Dr. Rees.
Okay. So we were already down there, and I think we'd already set up the consultation with Dr. Rees. It was very short. It was at the hospital. If I recall, it was in the emergency department in the hospital, or certainly one of the main areas downstairs. And it was very brief, and he essentially said, I can't assist you. That's not something I can help you with, but I can refer you to, I presume it was Dr. Lucas then.
So I asked Mr. Brown about Dr. Sebastian Lucas, and we've spoken about him earlier about sickle cell. And I explained that the inquiry does not have any records indicating a consultation took place with Dr. Lucas, whether with you or Mr. Brown or Mr. MacLeod. And I asked him if he remembered a consultation with Dr. Lucas, and his reply was, there was no consultation involving Crown Counsel and Sebastian Lucas, no. Now, from your memory earlier, you said you thought you had consulted with Dr. Lucas. Can you give me any more information? It may be that Mr. Brown wasn't present, or it was someone else. Do you remember any more about this? Because we simply don't have any records indicating there was a consultation.
I think that Mr. Brown will be correct. I wonder if what I had remembered was that consultation in London with the doctor you said was Dr. Rees, and I wonder if that was what I was mentioning, because I do recall that Dr. Lucas was coming right at the end of my consideration of the information. By the time he was reporting, I was already back up in Scotland and wasn't still down in London.
I asked Mr. Brown if there had been a consultation with a Dr. Jason Payne-James. He was one of the experts who'd been consulted by instructed by PERC before you were involved. And I said there was no record of any consultation with him, and he said no, there hadn't been a consultation with him. I'm assuming you will not disagree with that.
No, I won't.
I asked him about Mary Shepherd, and you've mentioned her today, Dr. Shepherd. He said, Mr. Brown said, there was an attempt to have a consultation with Dr. Mary Shepherd, but she was unavailable. So that was postponed and wasn't pursued. So that's right, there wasn't a consultation. I think that's what you've just told
Yes,
us.
you
agree with that?
In my perusal of the documents that I had available to me for giving evidence, I remember seeing that email. And it was really only that jogged my memory.
Right. And I asked about Professor Jack Crane. You'll remember that earlier today we've discussed the forensic pathologists who were in place, and we've talked about Dr. Shearer and Buhadir, Professor Crane, and Dr. Nat Carey and Dr. Lawler. And I asked about Professor Jack Crane, and he said no, there wasn't any consultation. Does that accord with your recollection?
I don't recall if there was a consultation earlier in the recognition process, but there wasn't a consultation with me. And I think, as I said to you earlier, the purpose of I chose who I wanted to consult with, and it was for a very specific purpose.
There was no consultation with Dr. Karch. And Les Brown indicated that, and obviously we've discussed the difficulties and issues that had been raised, concerns had been raised in relation to Dr. Karch. Did you consider at any stage, as part of reviewing the substance of his opinion, whether to consult with him?
I was satisfied that I had enough information to deal with his conclusions without consulting with him.
Right. To invite a jury to reject his conclusions if they were brought
before the court.
I asked Mr. Brown about Professor Anthony Fremont, the osteoarticular pathologist. We've spoken about him today. And I said the inquiry have no record of a consultation with him having taken place. And he also had no recollection of a consultation with him. Does that accord with your memory?
In this particular case, that is correct. But as I mentioned yesterday, I had been down to Manchester and consulted with him at length. He had given me a lot of information about his work and what he did and how he was able to date fractures. I vividly remember him doing a little small sketch for me that I had taken away. So I was satisfied that I understood his report as much as I needed to at that stage.
So you did consult with Professor Fremont in relation to Shekubio?
No, I'm sorry, in a different case.
In a different case?
I'm sorry, I was following on from my answer yesterday where I told you that I had contact with Professor Fremont in a different case, and I explained to you what that case was.
Did you have any consultation with him in relation to Mr. Bio's death?
No. And what I was trying to explain was I didn't think that was necessary because I'd understood his report to a sufficient degree.
And was that because of your previous consultation with him?
It was.
And we have no record of you consulting with Professor Edelstein. And I asked Les Brown about that, and he said no, there hadn't been anything along those lines. And I think you accept that you didn't consult with him.
Was he the toxicologist?
Yes, sorry.
Yes, that's correct.
So in relation to the experts that you did not consult with, that was because you felt you understood their reports sufficiently and you were satisfied you didn't need further explanation?
Not at that stage. If there had been criminal proceedings and I was going to lead the expert in evidence, then I would have had subsequent consultations.
Given the number of expert reports, and you've talked earlier about different views being expressed, I think earlier you suggested that the pathologists came to the same conclusion but by different routes. Did you consider exploring those different routes with each pathologist to make sure you truly understood who was correct whether there was significant differences between them, and what impact they may have had on you, the decision that you were going to come to in relation to whether there should be a prosecution.
No, from the information I had, I considered that I had the opportunity to analyse it to the sufficiently for the decision that I was going to make.
So, please tell me if I'm wrong about this, but as I understand your evidence, you consulted with Dr. Lawler,
You
the
remember
reviewing
that consultation?
pathologist, Dr. Bleetman, the
I
consultant
do, I
in
remember
emergency
that one, yes.
medicine, Dr. Shearer, the pathologist who did the post-mortem.
And that was in either Edinburgh or Glasgow, so I do remember that.
And who else did you consult with?
I can't remember, I'm sorry. There was a lot of consultations, and I'm trying to be careful to make sure that I don't confuse them. Round about that time, I travelled quite extensively down to London and the north of England, and down to Bristol as well with regard to non-accidental head injury in children. And there is something else round about that time that I went down to do consultations on. So there was a lot of consultations in that short space of time.
And that related to other trials and cases you were dealing with?
Yes.
Such as the one with Professor Fremont about a different case?
Yes.
But in relation to this phase of the process where you're consulting with experts in relation to this matter regarding Mr. Bio's death, you consulted with Shearer, Bleetman and Lawler?
I can't remember if there are more.
Right. Thank you. I'd like to move on actually and ask you now about some questions about the instruction of the OST expert. We've touched on this throughout your evidence, and as I understand it, we've heard evidence from James Wolfe, who was the Lord Advocate at the time, that he had no involvement with the selection of experts, other than, he says, in around December 2017, which was around the time that Fiona Carnan became involved. He had suggested that police forces elsewhere in the UK may have a suitably qualified restraint expert who could assist. And in his inquiry statement, and I don't need to go to this, at paragraph 52, he says there was an email exchange between his office and you at that time were the APCC, in around December 2017, in relation to identifying a suitably qualified restraint expert. Is that the sort of context in which a decision was taken about who to instruct and that a restraint expert would be brought on to assist?
I think there was quite a lot of conversation about who we could instruct, who would be the best expert, where we should look for that expert, who we should consult about who might be a suitable expert. So I suspect that going to the Lord Advocate was part of that process.
I would, do you remember after the Lord Advocate made that suggestion whether inquiries were made in England, Wales, other jurisdictions?
I didn't do that myself, but I'm obviously that's what the inquiry, that's what the team did.
We have the benefit now of a briefing note that was prepared which describes the background and the context regarding the instruction of Mr. Graves. Now, this wasn't prepared until February 2020, but it describes the circumstances at the time, and it was prepared by Alistair MacLeod. I wonder, as with other witnesses, if I could put some of that to you and ask you simply if it accords with your recollection of what was happening at the time. So this is a briefing note prepared by Alistair MacLeod, COPFS 02126A, 02126A. And this covers the period during which the Crown recognition was being looked into. And you'll see that it's headed up Alistair MacLeod at CAPD on the 28th of February 2020. At that time, the head of CAPD was Justin Farrell. So this is after the decision was made by you and your involvement. And it's a briefing note that covers the period and the work done between May 2015 and November 2019. And if we can look at the background, I'm interested in page 13, which covers the OST expert. There we are. And I'll read this short if I may, but you'll see it on the screen as I go through it. The Crown encountered considerable difficulty in identifying a suitable OST expert. A number of inquiries were made in England and Northern Ireland. In December 2017, the Metropolitan Police College in Hendon was approached for assistance. Unable to put forward one of their own officers to assist, they provided details of a known and trusted former training officer, Martin Graves, now operating as an OST expert in the private sector. And it was Martin Graves ultimately that was instructed in relation to this, wasn't it?
I do remember that.
And we've actually heard from Martin Graves in evidence, and the chair has that evidence available to him. So he was contacted on the 19th of December 2017 and provided with non-specific details, and the next day he forwarded his CV and confirmed he would be in a position to start reviewing the materials and be in a position to provide a report from mid-January 2018. I think at that stage it was anticipated that would be available to you before the Crown recognition was in your hands. Following Crown Council's agreement, Mr Graves was formally asked to provide a report on the 22nd of December 2017. So it would appear that if Mr Wolfe is correct in his recollection, he became involved in this issue because of the difficulties in December 2017, suggested looking down south or elsewhere for an expert, and as a result of those inquiries, Martin Graves was identified as a possible expert.
My recollection is we were already looking down south and potentially further afield.
Right.
So that was already happening. There was already extensive investigations in trying to identify an expert. And it was the fact that that was unsuccessful that we'd gone to asked the Lord Advocate.
I see. And had previous approaches been made to the Metropolitan Police College? Or was that only done after? Certainly in terms of the timing, it seems Mr Graves was contacted on the 19th of December. Was it after the Lord Advocate had become involved that approach was made?
I don't know, because I don't remember when the Lord Advocate became involved, but you will know that.
It says here that following Crown Council's agreement, Mr Graves was formally asked. I'm interested to what extent you had input into agreeing that Mr Graves should be asked and instructed as an expert.
I remember the process where we were trying to find an expert, that we were looking quite widely. We were casting our net quite widely. And I remember that he was identified. I don't recall what I had in front of me in order to say, yes, I agree. But certainly I recall that he was instructed. And I don't take any issue with the precognoser noting that there. If he's noted that's what I've done, then he will that will be correct. He's an extremely experienced case preparer. I had worked with him previously on the prosecution of a police officer in a 12-week trial, so I knew his work and I had full confidence in him.
Is that Alistair MacLeod?
Yes.
And then Mr Graves was contacted by telephone, and then a detailed letter of instruction and pen drive was couriered to Mr Graves' business address on the 24th of January 2018. The letter of instruction referred to a report delivery date of mid-February, which had been discussed previously. I'm interested in any involvement you had regarding the drafting of the letter of instruction or review of the letter of instruction that was prepared.
I think it might have been sent to me, and I think in fact the inquiry asked me about that in my statement. That was one of the documents that I had, I think, early on.
The letter of instruction.
I think so, and there's track changes on it, and actually now I'm saying that, maybe I'm getting that confused with another piece of correspondence. But I have certainly seen something where I have been involved in looking at the letter of instruction.
Thank you. I've not seen a version with track changes, but I can ask the team to check that over lunch.
Okay, maybe I'm getting confused with something else.
All right, thank you. And the pen drive, did that contain documents, digital documents, for the use by Mr. Graves as part of his instruction?
I would imagine that's what that's describing.
And what part did you play in deciding which documents should be sent to Mr. Graves?
I think you did you show me an email earlier from Les Brown with regard to Dr. Karch?
Yes, I think I showed you a letter of instruction to Dr. Karch.
No, it was whether
Did
an
I?
expert should have the Dr. Karch's.
Oh, the email chain, yes. We did look at that earlier. If you can give me a moment, I may be able to
So I think
find
that is an example of me inputting into what the OST expert is getting.
So you did have some input into that.
It looks like that from the
Yes.
email you showed me this morning.
Thank you. The original materials provided to Mr. Graves in January included documentation in relation to the training delivered to the material officers. On 21st February 2018, Mr. Graves was advised by email that PERC had carried out further inquiries in relation to the nature and content of officer training, and a further letter of instruction and materials was being prepared. So his instructions came not just simply in one letter of instruction, but a second supplementary letter of instruction along with materials was sent to him. And again, did you have some input into that second letter of instruction and the second bundle of materials?
I can't remember, but if there's correspondence to show that I did, then I'm happy to agree with that.
Now, I think it then says on the 22nd of February, Mr. Graves advised the Crown he'd not been able to devote time to preparing his report, and there were some issues about receiving his report at that stage. I don't need to go into those in detail. Can we move down the page, please? And then in March, the Precognosers made arrangements with Mr. Graves to discuss his emerging conclusions over the telephone. And if we move on to the next page, please. Although there had been a consultation with Mr. Graves that was very useful, he advised the Crown that his report would not be completed until the 6th of April 2018. Can I ask you, when you consulted with Mr. Graves, did you have his initial report?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
When you consulted with Mr. Graves, and you've spoken about that already, it's my understanding you already had a report from Mr. Graves when you consulted with him, but do you remember if you had a draft or initial version, or was it revised after the consultation? Do you remember anything about that?
I don't.
You don't? All right. It was decided not to submit a report to Crown Office until Mr. Graves' report was received and assessed and ongoing sickle cell investigations progressed. So can you tell me what that means then? As a result of not having the report from Mr. Graves, it was decided not to submit a report to Crown Office until Mr. Graves' report was received. So in terms of timing, was this in relation to when you got the Crown recognition?
I think so.
And they waited until Mr. Graves' report or final report was available before they sent that Crown recognition to you, is that correct? We're talking here about the report being available in April, and I'm just trying to pin down when you would have received the Crown recognition.
I don't remember when I received the Crown recognition. I do know that there was a target date of the end, in fact it was the beginning of the year, and then it moved to the end of January, and then it was February, March.
Right.
It seems from this report or this minute that it didn't come until even later than that. And of course there was some urgency that I wanted everything before I started consulting with or deciding which experts I wanted to consult with.
It would appear that the report was expected to be received in April. On the 5th of April, the day before the deadline, Mr Graves advised the Crown he required further time to complete his report, given the complex nature of the questions contained in the letter of instruction, and his report was received on the 14th of April. It was examined in detail. There were a number of typing, dictation errors, a number of points re factual inaccuracy were also raised with Mr Graves. After consideration of the points raised by the Crown, his initial report was treated as a draft, and he submitted his final report on the 29th of April 2018. I'm interested in what input you had at that time. After his initial report is received on the 14th of April, there's a number of typing errors, which are neither here nor there, but a number of points re factual accuracy were raised with Mr Graves, and I'm interested in any input you had at that time raising issues of factual accuracy.
I don't remember, I'm sorry. I mean, it could be that I've read the draft report, said I don't agree with that, or questioned this or X or Y, and then gone back to the precognoser, or it may be that Alistair himself noted them even without recourse to me. I can't recall.
Right. Do you
if he
remember?
did, there would be correspondence, because we weren't working in the same office, and he would have alerted me by email. So you will have that.
Thinking back now, do you remember what those points of factual accuracy were?
I don't.
Right. And it would appear that when you consulted with Dr Lawler on the 30th of January 2018, you did not have at that stage the Crown precognition or the report from Martin Graves.
That would be correct if this is correct. And that accords with my recollection, because I recall an email, and I've seen it in the correspondence that I have access to, where, or maybe it's in my notes actually, it might be in my notebooks, where there is a discussion about deadlines, and I remember February and March being mentioned.
And his final report was submitted on the 29th April, having reflected on the typing errors and the factual accuracy. And then Mr Graves was precognosed by the precognosers at Paisley Police Office on the 11th of May 2018. The inquiry has information available that indicates it was Fiona Carnan at that stage that precognosed Mr Graves in relation to his report.
And it surprises me that it was in Paisley. He must have travelled up for that consultation or precognition.
And prior to that consultation, precognition, which we understand was Fiona Carnan conducting with Mr Graves, did you have any input into what issues to explore with Mr Graves? What issues Fiona Carnan should explore with him? What points to probe or consider in detail?
I can't remember. I might have, but I can't remember.
Now, if that took place on the 11th of May, would it have been after that precognition that you would have received the Crown precognition? Or did you receive the Crown precognition prior to Mr Graves being precognosed?
I don't know. The Crown precognition, my recollection, came to me in hard copy. We worked almost exclusively in hard copy at that time. Whether I had some papers working directly from the statements and the productions before I had the final narrative, because you'll recall I mentioned before that I'd had sections of the narrative and also draft narratives as well. Whether I had access to that material and then the final precognition was delivered, or the final folder was delivered, my recollection is my folders went to 15 or 20 ring binders. So I just can't remember when that final piece was delivered, or whether it all came as a fresh copy. Sometimes it was termed as a golden copy, whether it was all a completely golden copy.
Thinking back now, do you remember if you received a golden copy as a final version?
I can't remember. it might have, even the papers that I did have, if it was going to be a trial, I probably wouldn't have been satisfied with what I had. I would want something else made up for trial.
And do you remember in this briefing note, this recognition took place now into May. Do you remember if the Crown recognition came to you as late as May?
From my notes and from my recollection, I was pushing from the January of that year to have a full recognition, a full set of papers, so that I could start my consultations and decide who to consult with. I think from what you've told me already, I've already started consulting by the 11th of May.
Well, certainly you consulted with Lawler on the 30th of January that year, and you consulted with Bleakman on the 9th of May that year.
So
you didn't consult with Shearer until the June.
okay. So I've obviously decided that I'm going to consult with Dr. Lawler even before I have the full set of papers. And by the time I consulted with Bleakman, I don't know, I don't recall.
Thank you.
But if I did have them by the 9th, then it didn't include the recognition of Mr. Graves, because that didn't happen until afterwards.
And I think I asked you about your involvement with his instruction, and I have an email available, COPFS 04881, and I wonder if we could have that on the screen. And I think this is an email exchange which we referred to earlier in relation to Dr. Karch. And if we can look at your reply of there's a, sorry, I don't know which page it's on. There should be a quote about, here we are, this is it. A reply from you, 19th January 2018, 11:34, to Fiona Carnan, and to Les Brown and Alistair MacLeod. And this related to the draft letter to the OST experts, and I think that's the letter of instruction. Dear all, mindful that this letter of instruction will become disclosable, and that would be disclosable to the defence if there was ever any trial, and ultimately form part of the full evidence of the expert, I have changed some of the language. So it would appear that you have revised the letter of instruction to Mr. Graves. Fiona, once you see the tracked changes, if you agree and accept, then we should have another look at how it reads, as it is a bit difficult to double check with all the tracks. It sounds like you'd made some substantial changes.
And it sounds also like other people have been involved in changing, because there are a number of tracks, presumably in different colours.
And as the team was set up, if a number of people are commenting, that could be Fiona Carnan, Alistair MacLeod, Erin Campbell, perhaps, if she was still
I
involved.
don't think Erin was there by that time.
Maybe Les Brown.
Yeah, absolutely, Les Brown, he's copied into this.
Would you be given it to do the final review? Or would you receive it at the same time as everyone else?
I don't know, sometimes I would get it right at the beginning, and we would all get I don't mean necessarily this team, sometimes it happens that it comes to me and everyone's asked for their comments, and you end up with something where everyone's altering different versions. Or it could be that they waited and then gave it to me.
All right. And then the final paragraph reads, in the bit about the PM, post-mortem I assume, a conclusion, I think we should add the quote from the PM repeated at page 130, volume 1 of the PERC. That's a reference to volume 1 of the PERC report. I think that is a nice clear summary. So you were adopting the summary in the PERC report and sending that to the expert?
On a particular aspect.
A particular aspect
that
in
I've
relation to the
identified.
post-mortem, is that correct?
That I've identified as clear.
I think all the important questions about restraint are spot on. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time again. I wonder if that might be an appropriate point to stop.
We'll stop for lunch and sit at 2 o'clock.